Hello everybody, this is Dan Murrell here with some breaking news. This is usually where you would find my box office show, Charts with Dan, and I will have it out later today, but literally in the middle of the night as I was finishing up prep on that show, some massive potential news dropped, which was a report from Matthew Baloney at the news outlet Puck that cited 3 different sources saying that Kathleen Kennedy, the, yes, controversial head of Lucasfilm, plans to step down as the head of Lucasfilm by the end of 2025. Baloney also claims that Kennedy had planned to step down last year, but instead decided to stay on for one final year. Now, it should be noted, and I have to underscore this, that these reports, or at least this report from Puck, has not been confirmed by Disney, Lucasfilm, or Kathleen Kennedy, so you should take it with a grain of salt until we do get final confirmation. That confirmation may be out by the time this is released early in the morning, but usually when a reporter drops a story like this in the middle of the night, I think it was after midnight Eastern time, that means that reporter is afraid that they are going to get scooped, which means that somebody else may have the story. So we will have to see if this is actually confirmed, but if it's true, this is of course a massive industry story because Kathleen Kennedy has been the head of Lucasfilm since it was sold to Disney back in 2012. And when you look at this, I don't think it's a huge shock that Kathleen Kennedy would be talking about retiring. She's 71 years old, and Lucasfilm doesn't have a whole lot that's in active production at the moment. Andor Season 2 will be coming out in just a few weeks. The Mandalorian and Grogu is in post-production, but everything else currently is essentially in development. There's not even something that's in active pre-production right now. So if I was an executive looking for a time to step away, this would be a logical time, even if you're just planning to hand over what you have to somebody else, although I have my own thoughts about that, which I'll share in a minute. So if Kennedy is indeed planning to step down this year, let's take a look back at her time as the head of Lucasfilm, which has certainly been rocky. There have been some very high highs and some very low lows. Kennedy's tenure, I think, got off to a good start back in 2015 with Star Wars The Force Awakens, which had outstanding box office, generally positive reviews, and introduced some new characters that many fans liked while bringing those legacy characters back into the fold. The Force Awakens was followed by Rogue One, a Star Wars story, the next year, which was a somewhat troubled production that still resulted in a financially successful and critically acclaimed film that many fans, myself included, think is the best of the new era of Star Wars. Things got a lot rockier with 2017 Star Wars The Last Jedi. While it was a financial success, it was so polarizing that people continue to argue about it to this day. Director Rian Johnson brought an iconoclastic approach to demystify the Star Wars mythology that essentially was the polar opposite of what J.J. Abrams brought to The Force Awakens, and this was the beginning of what I think was the biggest problem of the new era of Lucasfilm, which was kind of a big picture role from Kathleen Kennedy to hire directors and give them free rein for their projects without maybe considering how those projects would all mesh together. After The Last Jedi came Solo, a Star Wars story, another troubled production that saw Ron Howard replace Phil Lord and Chris Miller as director. That movie was neither a critical nor a fan favorite, and its worldwide gross of less than $400 million meant that it was the first live-action Star Wars movie to lose money at the box office. 2019's The Rise of Skywalker was more financially successful, but was another troubled production, with original director Colin Trevorrow leaving the project and J.J. Abrams returning, largely undoing much of the undoing that Rian Johnson already did. The resulting film was a mishmash of character arcs that I am not a fan of, and it really made the entire new trilogy feel completely chaotic and unplanned. Since 2019, the only other theatrical release from Lucasfilm was 2023's Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, another polarizing film. Even those who didn't hate the movie, like myself, agreed that it didn't capture the spirit of Indiana Jones, and it was a financial disaster at the box office because of its exorbitant production costs, which were ballooned by the COVID-19 pandemic. Kennedy also oversaw the launch of the streaming era of Star Wars on Disney+, and the results were very close to what happened to the franchise theatrically. Things started out strong in 2019 with Season 1 of The Mandalorian, which fans and critics alike both hailed as a return to greatness for Star Wars. However, the following 2 seasons seasons received a much more uneven reception. The Book of Boba Fett, which spun off of The Mandalorian, was largely seen as a disappointment, or at the very least an underwhelming story for one of Star Wars' most iconic but largely unexplored characters. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a tale of highs and lows, with some great storytelling regarding Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader, particularly with Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen returning to their roles from the prequel trilogy, that was balanced out in a negative way by more story issues, some plot choices and character choices that just didn't seem to fit with the rest of the show. 2022's Willow series was received fairly well critically, but did not generate high viewership for Disney+. It was eventually pulled off of the streaming service to be used as a tax write-off and currently isn't available for streaming anywhere. Dave Filoni's live-action Ahsoka series super served fans of the animated Star Wars show. However, it left some fans that were less immersed in the mythology feeling a bit left out in the cold. I was one of them. The Acolyte is maybe the low point of Disney's Star Wars streaming shows thus far. Despite a talented cast, its viewership was extremely low, which isn't good in any case, but especially because of the series' incredibly high cost. It wasn't renewed for a second season, and really I think the legacy of The Acolyte is the largely vitriolic discussion that was left in its wake, as well as the fact that it was a big swing for a original, or as original as you can get, new Star Wars series that just didn't connect. Star Wars Skeleton Crew was much better received by fans with its broader tone and return to space adventure, but viewership was also low, putting into question whether a second season or a spin-off series will eventually get a green light. And should Kennedy step down this year, the last released project in her tenure will be Andor Season 2, and you can't deny that Season 1 of Andor is one of the most acclaimed Star Wars movies or shows ever from both fans and critics. Should Season 2 stick the landing, it will at least let Kennedy leave with another successful project under her belt, but you can't deny that this tenure has been chaotic. For me, the biggest misstep that Lucasfilm under Kennedy's leadership made was constantly announcing new projects that never came into fruition. More movies from Rian Johnson, a trilogy from David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, a movie from Taika Waititi, a Rogue Squadron movie from Patty Jenkins. Right now, supposedly there is a Rey movie that's in development. A James Mangold movie is reportedly in development. A Lando streaming series or movie starring Donald Glover is reportedly in development. Really, the only thing we know we're getting is the Mandalorian and Grogu movie, which was directed by Jon Favreau and is in post-production right now. It's on the schedule for 2026. Other than that, the constant stream of stuff that never happened just added to the idea that there wasn't a whole lot of order over at Lucasfilm under the leadership of Kathleen Kennedy. It's actually kind of hard to approach talking about Kathleen Kennedy's legacy at Lucasfilm because not only is it mixed in with the up and down nature of so much of what happened with Star Wars and other franchises while she was the executive there, it's mixed in with the rise of YouTube and the angry Star Wars fan and the sort of content that is largely driven by hating Star Wars that we've seen over the last several years. The Fire Kathleen Kennedy battle cry has really fueled the rise of a lot of voices in the Star Wars fandom that have been rooting for her downfall. And I'm sure that many of them are celebrating about this news, especially if it does turn out to be true. But I've always thought that it was interesting that Kathleen Kennedy kind of became a Schrodinger's executive in a lot of the discussions about Star Wars. When something went wrong, she was solely to blame. And when something went right, she deserved none of the credit. I think that the answer lies somewhere in the middle. If I go back and I look in totality at her term as the head of Lucasfilm, do I think that she was a great executive? No, I don't. I think that there were just too many problems at the production phase, too many big picture issues for me to say that she did a fantastic job as the head of Lucasfilm. But I think that you also have to acknowledge that she was the head of a major division under the umbrella of a major corporation at Disney for the first time during a time of the most radical change in the media landscape, really since the invention of television. No division at Disney, including Marvel, has come out of the last few years unscathed. And so, yes, I do think some of that blame falls on Kathleen Kennedy. I think some of that blame also falls on Bob Iger and Bob Chapek, who, as the heads of Disney, mandated a ramp up in production in order to make stuff for Disney+. They wanted a Star Wars movie out every year first, then they wanted multiple Star Wars shows. The execution of that does largely come down to Kathleen Kennedy, but the big picture idea came from higher up than she is. Then you also throw in the pandemic, which threw everything into disarray, two major strikes, which threw everything into disarray once again. And I think that there are some mitigating factors here. And when you look at the media landscape overall, I think that executives at all levels made huge mistakes in the last 5 to 8 years. And one of those was the what I call strip mining of just about every intellectual property, not just Star Wars, in order to try to build up these streaming services, which I think was a big move that was also a big mistake for almost every studio. I actually have a lot of respect for Kathleen Kennedy as a producer. She is one of the most successful producers of all time. She produced some of the biggest hits of all time. She worked her way up at Amblin and eventually was shoulder to shoulder with Steven Spielberg when he was at his box office and some would say creative peak. She produced other movies that weren't directed by Steven Spielberg. I think she deserves a lot of respect in the industry and a lot of credit for what she did, but that doesn't change the fact that her tenure at Lucasfilm was very uneven. Kathleen Kennedy is a successful producer in her own right. However, I think it turns out that maybe she wasn't the best studio executive, which, by the way, has happened many, many times before in Hollywood's history. The major question now is what's next? And there are two names that have already been floating around forever as potential replacements for Kennedy at Lucasfilm. One of them is Dave Filoni, who joined the Star Wars franchise back in 2008 with the Clone Wars animated series. He came back and finished off that series with one last season in 2020, and he's been working on a lot of Star Wars projects since. He's done some great work in the Star Wars universe, but I would argue that he's been part of some of the less impressive work in recent years, including, and I think most notably, the Book of Boba Fett. Jon Favreau is another name that people have been throwing around to replace Kennedy, and he's also done some good work and some not so great work in the Star Wars universe. He's busy right now with The Mandalorian and Grogu, and my big question with Favreau is, does he even want to step in as a full-time Hollywood executive, or does he want the freedom to pursue some of his own projects? Just because he's largely been working with Disney and Star Wars in the last several years doesn't necessarily mean he wants to tie himself down to exclusively doing that for who knows how long. In my opinion, this is an opportunity to start fresh with Star Wars. Go find somebody new who's passionate about the franchise and who can lay out an overall vision for what the future is going to be. As I said, I think that Kennedy's biggest shortfall is that she was a manager, she was an executive, but she didn't have that vision of where the franchise should be in 2, 5, or 10 years. Find somebody that does. And I'm not saying that Filoni and Favreau don't have ideas or they're not capable of it, but I almost feel like they're too close to the franchise at this point. I think what you really want is a fresh start. You should absolutely consult with Filoni and Favreau because they are trusted collaborators, but I personally would not give either one of them the keys to the Star Wars kingdom. I don't know what bringing in somebody new would mean for what's currently in development, what would happen with the Rey movie and some of these other projects. But the status quo is something that I don't think that you need right now. You need a fresh start, and that may very well mean that we have some time without Star Wars for a while as things are regrouped, as a plan is made. And I also don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Star Wars has gone away in the past for a number of years and come back very strong, hotly anticipated, fans ready to see what's new. What are the new ideas and the new things that the creators have in store? First George Lucas, then when it came back with Disney. I think that most Star Wars fans, whether they loved, hated, or somewhere in between all of the stuff that's come out over the last 10 years, would agree that it's okay if we go a little while without Star Wars, especially if it's to regroup and come back with a really clear plan for what to do. And I don't think that anything should be off the table. Now, I don't think that you should decanonize the new trilogy and remake those. I think that's going a little bit too far. But I think that you can make some radical changes to the franchise at this point because, to be frank, it's kind of at a low as far as audience trust that what they're getting is going to be consistently good. We've had great and we've had not so great. Am I cheering and clapping as Kathleen Kennedy walks out the door? No, I'm not, but I also think that this is probably the right move for Lucasfilm at this point. I think it is a natural time for her to step down, and I think that it's probably the right time for her to step down. I was never on the fire Kathleen Kennedy train, but I did believe and do believe that this is probably the right time to hand the reins to somebody else. This is, of course, assuming that this report is true, that Kennedy is planning to retire this year. And if she is planning to retire, let's hope that whoever they bring in next, whether it's Filoni, Favreau, or somebody else, can restore something that's been missing from the Star Wars franchise for quite some time, which is balance. So those are my thoughts on this potential blockbuster story. What do you think? If there's one thing I know, it's that there are a lot of thoughts around Kathleen Kennedy. Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, stay tuned right here for more movie news, reviews, box office, which you'll get later today, and more, including coverage of the Academy Awards, which are now less than a week away. But for now, thanks for watching this video. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.